The subway car screeched to a halt, its mechanical groan echoing down the desolate platform. Nora slung her messenger bag over her shoulder and stepped aboard. She had taken this late-night ride countless times, returning from her shift at the diner in the heart of the city. Tonight, though, something felt off. She scanned the dimly lit car. It was empty except for a man slouched in the far corner, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. The doors clanged shut, and the train jerked forward. Nora chose a seat near the center of the car, keeping her distance from the man. She dug out her headphones, hoping to drown out the unsettling atmosphere with music. But as she slipped them on, she noticed something strange. The flickering overhead lights reflected off the grimy windows, creating ghostly silhouettes that didn't match the car's layout. "Rough night?" a gravelly voice asked. Nora startled, looking up. The hooded man had shifted, leaning slightly forward. His face was pale, his eyes deep-set and oddly luminous. There was an intensity to his gaze that made her stomach churn. "Yeah, you could say that," she replied cautiously, trying to keep her tone neutral. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He smoothed it out on his knee, his long fingers trembling. "You ever get the feeling," he began, his voice low and measured, "that this place isn't what it seems? That sometimes you're not the one riding the train, it's riding you?" A chill crept up Nora's spine. She forced a smile and looked away, pretending to check her phone, but there was no signal, not even the faintest bar. Her music app refused to load. As the train hurtled through the tunnels, the lights flickered more violently, plunging the car into brief moments of darkness. In one of these blackouts, Nora heard a sound, a wet, squelching noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. When the lights returned, the hooded man was gone. Her heart pounded as she stood up and peered down the car. There was no sign of him. The paper he had been holding lay crumpled on the seat he had occupied. Against her better judgment, Nora picked it up. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, and the words sent a wave of nausea rolling through her. "Don't look at the reflections. They see you too." Nora glanced at the windows again, and this time, her reflection didn't mimic her movement. It was staring at her, its lips curling into a sinister smile. Nora staggered back into her seat, clutching the crumpled paper as though it might protect her. The reflection in the window wasn't hers anymore. It tilted its head, examining her with an eerie curiosity, its movements slow and deliberate. When she blinked, it didn't. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she turned away from the glass. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of the light or her exhausted mind playing games. The subway car swayed, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks failing to soothe her frayed nerves. She needed to get off this train at the next stop, no matter where it was. The train plunged into another blackout. This one lasted longer. In the oppressive darkness, the dragging sound returned, closer this time. Her breath hitched. She clutched her bag tighter, her nails digging into the worn leather strap. When the lights came back, the car was still empty, or so it seemed. A whisper slithered through the air, soft and taunting. "Don't run. They love it when you run." She whipped her head around, her eyes darting to every shadowy corner, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in the cavernous emptiness of the train. The subway screeched, throwing her forward in her seat. The train slowed as it approached a station, one she didn't recognize. The platform was barely lit, the faint yellow glow of a single flickering bulb revealing grimy walls streaked with what looked like rust. Or was it something darker? The train stopped, but the doors didn't open. Nora stood, her legs trembling, and pressed the button to release the door. Nothing happened. She pounded on it, panic rising in her chest. "Please," she shouted, her voice cracking. "Let me out." A reflection caught her eye, pulling her gaze back to the window. This time, her doppelganger wasn't alone. Several shadowy figures stood behind it, their forms distorted and unnatural, their eyes glowing faintly. One of them raised a hand, pressing it against the glass as though it could reach through. The subway jolted forward, the station vanishing into the darkness. Nora stumbled, catching herself on a pole. She felt trapped, caught in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her phone was useless, her music app frozen on a blank screen. The clock on her lock screen blinked 12:13, stuck on the same time no matter how many times she checked it. "Help me," she whispered, though there was no one to hear her. The car groaned, its walls shuddering as though the train itself were alive. The lights dimmed again, plunging her into semi-darkness. This time, the dragging sound was accompanied by something else, a low, guttural growl that made her blood run cold. When the lights returned, a figure stood at the far end of the car. It wasn't the hooded man. This thing was taller, its limbs elongated and unnatural. Its face was obscured by a veil of shadows, but its eyes glowed like embers. "You shouldn't have looked," it said, its voice a distorted rasp. Nora backed away, her mind screaming at her to do something. Anything, but her body was frozen. The thing began to move, each step deliberate and horrifyingly slow. Its presence filled the car, pressing down on her like a tangible weight. In her panic, she remembered the emergency brake. Her fingers fumbled for the lever, and with a desperate cry, she yanked it down. The train screeched, sparks flying as it ground to a violent halt. Nora was thrown to the floor, her head slamming against the cold metal. Dazed, she struggled to her feet, her vision swimming. The car was empty again. The thing was gone, but the reflection in the window was still smiling. Nora's head throbbed, but she forced herself upright, clutching the pole for support. The train sat still, its silence heavier than the darkness that had surrounded her earlier. She glanced at the window, avoiding her reflection, and scanned the platform outside. It was impossible to tell where she was. The station's signage was obscured by grime and what looked like scratch marks. Her mind screamed for her to leave the car, but her body hesitated. What if the thing was still out there, lurking in the shadows? What if it was safer to stay on the train, no matter how cursed it seemed? The overhead lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the floor. A low hum filled the car, a mechanical sound that grew louder with every second, vibrating in her chest. She gripped the emergency brake lever, prepared to pull it again, though she doubted it would do much good now. A sudden hiss erupted from the doors, and they slid open. The sound was deafening in the oppressive silence. Beyond the threshold was not the platform she had glimpsed earlier. It was something else. The ground was slick, reflective, as though coated in oil. Shadows danced on the surface, forming shapes that slithered and twisted before vanishing into nothingness. The air shimmered, distorting the space like heat waves rising from asphalt. "Step through," a voice whispered, soft and hypnotic. Nora spun around, searching for the source, but the car was still empty. Her reflection in the window, however, had turned its head toward her, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. Its lips moved, though no sound came. She backed away, shaking her head. "No, I'm not going out there." The reflection smiled wider, its teeth sharp and gleaming. "You don't have a choice." Before she could react, the floor beneath her feet shifted. It wasn't solid anymore. She felt herself sinking, her shoes sticking to the surface like tar. Panic surged through her as she struggled to free herself, but the more she fought, the deeper she sank. The figures from the reflections began to materialize, stepping out of the windows as though the glass were a portal. They surrounded her, their distorted shapes towering over her. Their eyes glowed with a sickly yellow hue, their mouths opening in silent screams. "Stop," she shouted, thrashing against the sticky floor. "Get away from me." One of the figures bent down, its face inches from hers. Its breath was cold, carrying the stench of decay. "You looked," it said, its voice reverberating through her skull. "And now you belong to us." The train jolted violently, as if something massive had collided with it. The impact threw her free of the sticky floor, sending her sprawling toward the open door. She scrambled to her knees, her palms slick with whatever substance coated the ground, and lunged for the platform. She landed hard, the wind knocked out of her. Gasping, she rolled onto her back and stared up at the flickering light above. The shadows were gone, but the voice still echoed in her mind. "You belong to us." The train began to move again, the doors slamming shut with a finality that made her heart sink. She watched as it disappeared into the tunnel, its taillights glowing like red eyes. The platform was silent now, but the air felt charged, like a storm was brewing underground. She pulled herself to her feet, her legs shaking, and looked around. There were no signs, no maps, nothing to indicate where she was. And then she saw it. At the far end of the platform stood the hooded man. He was facing her now, his features still obscured, but his presence was undeniable. In his hand, he held another crumpled piece of paper. "You made it this far," he said, his voice echoing as though carried by the tunnels. "But you're not safe yet." Nora's breath hitched as the hooded man began to approach, his movements slow but deliberate. The faint light from the flickering bulb above cast his shadow long and warped across the platform. She wanted to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The platform stretched into endless darkness on either side, and the walls pressed in, damp and foreboding. "What do you mean I'm not safe?" she demanded, her voice trembling but firm. "What's happening to me?" The man stopped a few feet away, tilting his head as though studying her. His hood slipped back slightly, revealing hollow eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "You looked into the glass," he said, his tone almost pitying. "You let them see you." "I didn't mean to," Nora whispered. "Intent doesn't matter. Once they've seen you, they never forget." She clenched her fists, anger bubbling up through her fear. "Who are they? What do they want from me?" The man handed her the crumpled paper, his hands unnaturally cold as they brushed hers. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. The message was scrawled in the same jagged handwriting. "You can't run. You can only hide." A low rumble filled the station, the walls vibrating as though something massive was moving through the tunnels. The man's gaze darted to the darkened tracks, his face twisting with urgency. "They're coming. You have to leave, now." Nora looked around wildly. "How? The train's gone, and there's no way out." He pointed to a narrow staircase at the far end of the platform, barely visible in the dim light. "That's your only chance. But if they catch you before you reach the surface..." His voice trailed off, and he didn't need to finish. The rumble grew louder, accompanied by a distant, guttural howl that made her blood run cold. She didn't need any more convincing. Without another word, she sprinted toward the stairs, her shoes slapping against the slick concrete. The air grew heavier with each step, as though the station itself were alive and trying to pull her back. Shadows flitted along the walls, keeping pace with her, their forms twisting and merging into monstrous shapes. "Don't stop," the man's voice echoed behind her, though she didn't dare turn around. She reached the stairs and began to climb, her legs burning with exertion. The howling grew deafening, a cacophony of voices layered over each other, each one screaming her name. She stumbled, catching herself on the cold metal railing, and pushed onward. As she ascended, the air changed. It felt lighter, fresher, like she was nearing the surface. But the shadows weren't letting her go so easily. They surged up the staircase, a tide of darkness that threatened to swallow her whole. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs, a woman in a pristine white coat, her face calm but her eyes filled with urgency. "Take my hand," she called, reaching out. Nora hesitated for a split second. The woman seemed out of place in this nightmare, her presence too perfect, too convenient. But the shadows were closing in, and she had no other option. She grasped the woman's hand, and the world shifted. The oppressive darkness of the subway was gone. She stood on a bustling street, under the glow of streetlights, the sounds of the city around her. Cars honked, people laughed, and the distant hum of life was a stark contrast to the silence of the tunnels. The woman in the white coat was gone, so was the hooded man. Nora sank to her knees, trembling, her body finally giving in to the fear and exhaustion. She looked around, half expecting to see the shadows lurking in the corners, but there was nothing, just the city, alive and indifferent. She pulled out her phone, relieved to see it working again. The time read 1:13 a.m. She'd been gone for exactly an hour. As she stood, trying to gather herself, she caught her reflection in the window of a nearby storefront. Her heart stopped. The reflection wasn't hers. It was smiling. The rhythmic screech of steel wheels on iron rails echoed through the dimly lit subway tunnel as Eliza stepped onto the nearly deserted platform. It was late, much later than she intended to stay at work, and the exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. Clutching her oversized bag, she scanned the platform, her eyes catching only one other passenger, a man in a hooded sweatshirt slouched against a grimy bench. The air smelled of damp concrete and stale air, a faint but persistent hum of fluorescent lights adding to the eerie silence. Eliza adjusted her scarf, a futile attempt to stave off the chill seeping into her bones. She had always found the subway unsettling at night, but tonight, it felt different. The silence wasn't just empty, it felt charged, as though the walls themselves held their breath. The distant wail of the approaching train offered momentary relief, but as the headlights emerged from the tunnel, the oppressive feeling only deepened. The doors hissed open, and Eliza stepped inside, her heels clicking against the worn metal floor. The car was nearly empty, except for an elderly woman muttering to herself near the far end, and a teenage boy with headphones sprawled across 2 seats. Choosing a spot in the middle, Eliza settled into the cracked vinyl seat and pulled out her phone. She sent a quick text to her roommate. "On the train? Be home soon." The train lurched forward, and the flickering lights cast unsettling shadows on the walls. Eliza glanced around. The elderly woman's voice grew louder, her incoherent mumbling punctuated by sharp giggles. The boy didn't even stir, his music audible through the tinny leak of his headphones. Eliza tried to focus on her screen, but a creeping sense of unease made her heart pound. It wasn't the passengers. It wasn't the shadows. It was something else, something unseen but palpable. Her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced down, expecting a reply from her roommate, but the screen displayed a message she hadn't seen before. "Stay alert. Don't trust them." She frowned, her fingers hovering over the screen. She hadn't received a message like this before, and it wasn't from any contact in her phone. The sender was listed as unknown. Eliza's pulse quickened as she looked up, her eyes darting around the car. The elderly woman had stopped muttering and was staring directly at her, a crooked smile spreading across her wrinkled face. The teenage boy's music had abruptly stopped, and his head snapped toward her, his expression vacant but unnervingly intense. Eliza clutched her bag tighter, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The train plunged into a tunnel, and the lights flickered off completely, plunging the car into darkness. Eliza's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she gripped the edge of her seat. When the lights returned, her stomach dropped. The elderly woman was now sitting directly across from her, her cloudy eyes unblinking. The teenage boy was gone. "What do you want?" Eliza managed, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her tattered coat and pulled out a small, tarnished mirror. She held it up, angling it so Eliza could see her own reflection. But what stared back wasn't her. The reflection showed Eliza sitting in the same seat, but her face was pale, her eyes sunken, and her lips twisted in a scream she hadn't made. Panicking, Eliza bolted from her seat, the mirror slipping from the woman's hand and shattering on the floor. The sound reverberated through the car like a gunshot. The elderly woman let out a guttural laugh, her voice echoing in a way that defied the small space. "It's only the beginning," she rasped as the train screeched to a sudden halt. Eliza stumbled forward, barely managing to stay upright. The doors opened, revealing a station she didn't recognize. The walls were lined with faded posters, their slogans in a language she couldn't decipher. A cold wind blew through the car, carrying whispers that seemed to come from every direction. She hesitated, torn between staying in the unsettling train or stepping into the even more terrifying unknown. The choice was made for her when the doors began to close. She darted through them just in time, finding herself alone on the platform. The train pulled away, its taillights vanishing into the darkness. Eliza turned in a slow circle, her unease mounting as she realized there were no exits, no stairs, no signs of where she was, just the empty platform and the oppressive dark. And then she heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows. Eliza froze, her breath hitching as the growl reverberated through the desolate station. The sound wasn't human, it was primal, raw, and far too close. Clutching her bag like a lifeline, she took a hesitant step backward, her heels clicking against the cold concrete. The faint echoes seemed to mock her, bouncing off the unseen walls of the cavernous space. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. The word felt absurd as soon as it left her lips. Whatever made that sound wasn't someone who'd answer her. The growl came again, followed by the soft scrape of something dragging along the floor. Eliza's heart hammered in her chest as she spun around, scanning the dimly lit platform. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting shadows that shifted like living things. She could make out vague shapes in the darkness, columns, benches, and something else. Something that moved. Instinct took over, and Eliza bolted down the platform, her boots pounding against the concrete. She didn't know where she was running, only that she had to get away. The dragging sound grew louder, accompanied by an irregular tapping, like claws clicking against the ground. As she ran, the platform seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit nowhere in sight. She risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. A figure emerged from the shadows, hunched and grotesque. Its limbs were elongated, joints bending at unnatural angles, and its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly with a sickly yellow hue. Eliza bit back a scream and pushed herself to run faster, her lungs burning with the effort. She spotted an alcove up ahead, a door slightly ajar with a faint light spilling out. Without hesitation, she darted inside, slamming the door shut behind her and twisting the lock. Her chest heaved as she pressed her back against the door, her mind racing. The room she'd entered was small and cluttered, filled with abandoned tools, a rusted filing cabinet, and a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. She leaned her head back, trying to calm her breathing, but the tapping noise started again, now on the other side of the door. Eliza's hands shook as she searched for something, anything, to defend herself. Her fingers brushed against a rusted wrench, and she grabbed it, gripping it tightly. The tapping turned into pounding, and the door shuddered under the force. "Leave me alone," she shouted, raising the wrench as though it could protect her from whatever was outside. The pounding stopped. Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Eliza didn't dare move, her ears straining for any sound. Then slowly, the doorknob began to turn. "No, no," she whispered, retreating further into the room. The door creaked open just a fraction, enough for her to see the yellow glow of those eyes peering through the crack. She swung the wrench with all her might, slamming it against the door. The creature let out an inhuman screech, and the door slammed shut again. Her victory was short-lived. A deep, guttural laugh echoed from the other side, followed by a voice that sent chills down her spine. "You can't hide forever, Eliza." Her blood ran cold. It knew her name. "How?" she stammered, but the words caught in her throat. She turned toward the room, searching for another way out. Her eyes landed on a ventilation grate near the floor, barely large enough for her to crawl through. It was her only chance. Dropping to her knees, Eliza pried the grate loose with the wrench, the metal squealing in protest. The noise seemed to spur the creature on. The pounding on the door resumed, more violent than before. She didn't look back as she scrambled into the vent, dragging her bag behind her. The metal shaft was narrow and cold, the edges scraping against her knees and elbows as she crawled. Her breaths came in short, panicked gasps, each movement echoing ominously in the confined space. Behind her, the sound of splintering wood told her the door hadn't held. She didn't dare stop, even as her muscles screamed in protest. The vent twisted and turned, disorienting her, but she kept going, driven by pure survival instinct. A faint light appeared ahead, and she crawled toward it with renewed determination. The vent ended in another grate, and through it, she could see what appeared to be another platform. She kicked at the grate with all her strength, the metal finally giving way. Tumbling out onto the platform, she lay there for a moment, gasping for air. But the relief was short-lived. This platform wasn't like the last one. The air here was thick and stifling, and the walls were lined with strange, pulsating growths that glowed faintly. The tracks were covered in a viscous black substance that seemed to writhe on its own. And then she saw them. Dozens of figures stood in the shadows, their eyes glowing yellow. They turned toward her in unison, their movements eerily synchronized. Eliza scrambled to her feet, her mind racing for a plan. But as she turned to run, a voice echoed through the station, low, commanding, and impossibly familiar. "You've entered our domain, Eliza. There's no going back." Eliza staggered backward, her heart pounding as the voice reverberated through the grotesque station. The figures with glowing yellow eyes began to advance, their movements unnervingly slow and deliberate, like predators savoring the hunt. The walls of the station pulsed in rhythm with her racing heartbeat, their organic texture oozing a dark, viscous fluid that pooled onto the ground. "You don't belong here," the voice continued, deep and resonant, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "But you've come too far to turn back." "I didn't mean to," Eliza shouted, her voice cracking. She clutched her wrench, the only semblance of a weapon she had left. "I don't even know where I am." A figure stepped forward from the crowd, its form slightly more distinct than the others. It was taller, its elongated limbs cloaked in shadow, but its face, or what should have been its face, was a void. No features, no expression, just a swirling black emptiness where a face should be. "You're on the other line," it said, its voice a distorted echo of the one she'd heard before. "A place between destinations where the lost find themselves or are found." The words chilled Eliza to her core. She took a step back, but her heel slipped in the slick substance coating the platform. She nearly fell, catching herself on one of the pulsating walls. The moment her hand touched it, a shock of cold shot through her arm, and images flooded her mind, glimpses of others who had stood where she was now. Faces twisted in terror, screams echoing in silence, and then nothing. The crowd of figures closed in, their movements slow but purposeful. Eliza's breathing grew ragged as she searched for an escape. The tracks stretched out before her, glistening with the same black substance. She didn't know where they led, but staying wasn't an option. With a surge of desperation, she turned and jumped down onto the tracks. The figures paused, their glowing eyes fixed on her, as though they were waiting for her next move. The black substance on the tracks clung to her boots, making each step a struggle. The further she moved down the tunnel, the thicker the air became, heavy with an unplaceable metallic scent. "Run all you like," the faceless figure called after her, its voice carrying effortlessly through the tunnel. The tracks lead only to truth, and truth is always hungry. Eliza ignored it, her feet slipping and sliding as she pushed forward. The tunnel was endless, a black maw that seemed to stretch on forever. The faint light from the station behind her began to fade, replaced by a dim, pulsing glow emanating from the walls. The substance on the tracks seemed to writhe beneath her feet, as though alive. Then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a train approaching. But this train didn't sound like any she'd ever heard. The noise was deeper, more guttural, like the roar of some massive mechanical beast. Panic surged through her as the tunnel began to tremble. She turned her head, catching sight of two pinpricks of light in the distance. The train was coming, and it wasn't stopping. Eliza broke into a sprint, adrenaline overpowering her exhaustion. The tracks vibrated beneath her, and the roar grew deafening. The black substance seemed to reach for her, tendrils wrapping around her ankles and slowing her down. She swung the wrench wildly, breaking free of their grip, but the train was closing in fast. Up ahead, she spotted a side tunnel, narrow and barely visible in the dim glow. It was her only chance. With a final burst of energy, she lunged for it, diving into the opening just as the train thundered past. The force of the passing train threw her against the rough wall of the tunnel, the wind tearing at her hair and clothes. She gasped for air, her lungs burning. When she opened her eyes, the train was gone, its roar fading into the distance. Eliza lay there for a moment, the silence almost as oppressive as the noise had been. The side tunnel was cramped and cold, the walls damp and lined with strange vein-like patterns that pulsed faintly. She dragged herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. "Where do I go now?" she muttered, her voice trembling. She glanced back at the main tunnel, but it was empty, save for the lingering black substance that seemed to ripple with its own life. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the direction she'd come. Not the slow, deliberate steps of the figures, but hurried, frantic ones. Someone or something was chasing her. "No," Eliza whispered, gripping the wrench tightly. "Not again." She turned deeper into the side tunnel, her steps quick and uneven. The passage twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until she had to squeeze through in places. The pulsing light grew dimmer, and the air turned colder. Finally, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. In the center stood an old, rusted control panel, covered in dust and cobwebs. A single lever jutted out, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. Eliza approached it cautiously, her instincts screaming that this was important. Etched into the wall above the lever were words in jagged, uneven letters. "One path forward, one price paid." "What does that mean?" she murmured, her voice trembling. Behind her, the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. She didn't have time to think. Reaching out with shaking hands, Eliza gripped the lever and pulled. The chamber shuddered violently, and a deafening screech filled the air. The floor beneath her began to shift, tilting at an impossible angle. Eliza screamed as she was thrown forward, falling into the unknown. Eliza fell for what felt like an eternity, the air rushing past her as her screams were swallowed by the void. When she finally hit the ground, the impact knocked the wind from her lungs, leaving her gasping and disoriented. She lay on a cold, metallic surface, its texture smooth but unnaturally warm, as though it were alive. She forced herself to her knees, her head spinning. The chamber she had landed in was vast, its walls shimmering with an iridescent sheen. Strange symbols pulsed faintly on the surfaces, shifting and changing as she watched. The air here was different, dense, almost liquid, and filled with a low hum that resonated deep in her bones. "Eliza," the voice boomed, louder and clearer than ever. It was the same voice that had haunted her since she stepped off the train, but now it was more personal, almost intimate. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. She staggered to her feet, clutching the wrench like a talisman. "What do you want from me?" A shape began to form in the air before her, coalescing from the shimmering light. It was humanoid but abstract, its edges constantly shifting, its form refusing to settle. The void where its face should be reflected her own image, distorted and fractured. "I am what lies beneath," it said, its voice a chorus of whispers layered over a guttural roar. "The forgotten truths, the unseen paths. You sought escape, and you found me." "I didn't seek anything," Eliza shouted, the wrench trembling in her hand. "I just wanted to go home." The figure laughed, a sound that reverberated through the chamber, making her ears ring. "Home? There is no home. Not anymore. You've crossed the threshold, Eliza. You've seen what lies beyond the veil. Do you think you can simply return?" Tears welled in her eyes, her frustration and fear boiling over. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any of this." The figure extended a hand, or what might have been a hand, toward her. "Every choice has a cost. Every journey, a destination. You pulled the lever. Now, you must decide." The chamber began to shift, the walls rippling like water. Two paths emerged from the swirling light, each leading to a doorway. One was bathed in a harsh, white light that hurt her eyes to look at. The other was cloaked in shadow, its depths impenetrable. "What are these?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Two paths forward," the figure said. "One leads to the world you left behind, though it will not be as you remember. The other leads deeper, to the truths you fear but cannot escape." Eliza's mind raced. The idea of returning to her old life, even if it was altered, was tempting. But the figure's words lingered in her mind. Truths you fear but cannot escape. What if going back didn't mean safety? What if the horrors followed her? She looked at the shadowed doorway, its darkness almost inviting. Could she face the unknown? Could she confront the truths that had been chasing her since she boarded that cursed train? "Make your choice, Eliza," the figure urged, its form beginning to dissipate. "The train waits for no one." Eliza clenched her fists, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Every instinct screamed for her to run toward the light, to cling to the familiarity of the life she had known. But something deeper, a flicker of courage or maybe defiance, drew her toward the darkness. "I'm not afraid," she whispered, though her trembling hands betrayed her. "Not anymore." With a deep breath, she stepped toward the shadowed doorway. As she crossed the threshold, the darkness enveloped her, and the chamber vanished. She emerged onto a subway platform, but it wasn't the one she had left. The station was pristine, its walls gleaming white, the air fresh and still. A single train sat waiting, its doors open. Cautiously, Eliza stepped onto the train, the inside brighter and cleaner than any she had ever seen. She sank into a seat, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind alert. As the train began to move, she glanced at her reflection in the window. For a moment, she thought it was someone else, a version of herself that was older, wearier, but unbroken. The train sped forward, the tunnels flashing past in a blur. She didn't know where it was taking her, but for the first time, she felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it. She had survived the other line. As the train emerged into the light, she closed her eyes, letting the warmth wash over her. Somewhere, deep within the shadows, the figure's voice echoed one last time. Truth is a journey, Eliza, and you've only just begun. The city never truly slept, but it had its moments of restless silence, particularly after midnight. Marla Hayes stood on the grimy subway platform, her reflection flickering faintly in the streaked glass of the closed snack kiosk. She adjusted her bag over her shoulder, her tired eyes scanning the sparsely populated platform. A janitor in a neon vest swept a corner absently. A teenage couple argued quietly by a vending machine, and a lone businessman leaned against a pillar, scrolling through his phone with robotic precision. Marla worked late shifts at a marketing firm, a thankless job she had grown to hate. The nightly commute had become a bleak routine. But tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the subway had absorbed too much of the city's despair and decided to radiate it back. The train screeched into the station, an ancient beast dragging itself toward the platform. Its fluorescent lights flickered ominously as the doors hissed open. Marla hesitated for a moment, her instincts whispering caution, but she shrugged it off. She was too tired to let her imagination run wild. She stepped into the nearly empty car, choosing a seat close to the center, away from the doors. A man with a hood pulled low over his face sat hunched at the far end, his fingers twitching on his knees. 2 stops later, the teenage couple got on, their argument continuing in hushed tones. Marla pulled out her headphones, hoping to drown out the world, but the device refused to power on. As the train moved through the tunnels, the fluorescent lights began to flicker, casting the car into brief moments of darkness. Each time the light returned, the hooded man appeared to be sitting slightly closer to Marla, though she hadn't seen him move. Her heart quickened, but she convinced herself it was a trick of her tired mind. At the next station, the teenage couple exited, their absence amplifying the car's silence. Marla glanced nervously at the man, but he was motionless now, his hood obscuring his face entirely. She gripped the strap of her bag tightly, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Then the train stopped between stations, the power flickering off completely. For a moment, the only sound was the faint creaking of the train settling on the tracks. In the suffocating darkness, Marla heard a whisper, close, too close. "You're not alone down here." Marla froze, every muscle in her body stiff with fear. The whisper was unmistakable, a hoarse rasp that carried more malice than words ever should. She whipped her head toward the hooded man, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dark. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. The oppressive darkness seemed to stretch on forever before the lights flickered back to life, weak and sputtering like a dying flame. The hooded man was gone. Marla's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the car. There was no sign of movement, no sound except the faint hum of the train and her own rapid breathing. "Hello?" She tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. Then she saw it. A shadow at the edge of the car, just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. It moved unnaturally, gliding rather than walking, and it wasn't alone. A second, then a third shadow joined it, their indistinct forms merging and splitting apart like smoke caught in a draft. Marla's mind raced. Was this some kind of hallucination? Stress and exhaustion playing tricks on her senses? She gripped her bag tightly and debated making a dash for the emergency intercom, but the shadows began to inch closer. They weren't just lingering, they were hunting. The train jolted suddenly, throwing her forward. She caught herself on the seat in front of her, her bag spilling onto the floor. As she scrambled to collect her things, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic. It was an old key, large and ornate, as though it belonged to a time long past. She hadn't seen it before, and it certainly wasn't hers. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the car, sending chills down her spine. She clutched the key instinctively, as though it might offer some protection. The shadows were closer now, their shapes more defined. One had elongated arms that seemed to stretch toward her, its fingers curling in the air like claws. Desperation fueled her actions as she bolted toward the nearest door. She slammed her fists against the emergency release button, but nothing happened. The train wasn't moving, and yet she felt as though it were hurtling toward something far worse than any station. The laugh came again, louder this time, reverberating off the walls of the car. "You're not supposed to be here." A voice snarled, and she realized with horror that it was coming from all around her, as though the very walls were speaking. The shadows surged forward, their movements quick and chaotic. Marla screamed and held the key out in front of her like a weapon. To her astonishment, the shadows recoiled, hissing like wounded animals. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice breaking. The key glinted faintly in the dim light, its surface etched with strange, intricate symbols. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the train began to move again. The shadows retreated into the corners, their forms dissolving into the walls as the light stabilized. Marla sank into the nearest seat, clutching the key tightly. Whatever was happening, she knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary subway ride. The train screeched and shuddered as it pulled into a station Marla didn't recognize. The name on the platform sign was illegible, the letters distorted as though smeared by a giant hand. The station itself was dark and lifeless, its walls covered in graffiti that looked more like ancient symbols than modern tags. Marla hesitated. The thought of stepping into the unknown was terrifying, but staying on the train seemed even worse. Her grip on the mysterious key tightened as she inched toward the door. Before she could decide, the intercom crackled to life. "Next stop. End of the line." The robotic voice was cold and final, sending a wave of dread through her. As if on cue, a figure appeared in the doorway between cars. It was the conductor, or at least it looked like one. He wore a tattered uniform, his face obscured by a shadow despite the light overhead. His voice was gravelly when he spoke. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you." Marla stepped back, her instincts screaming at her to run. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice barely steady. The conductor tilted his head, the movement unnatural, like a marionette on strings. "The key. Hand it over, and maybe you'll make it out alive." She clutched the key tighter, feeling its cold surface bite into her palm. "Why should I trust you?" The conductor let out a low, guttural laugh. "Trust? Oh, no. This isn't about trust. It's about survival." His hand shot forward, impossibly long fingers reaching for her. Marla ducked instinctively, the conductor's hand swiping inches above her head. She bolted down the aisle, her heart pounding as the train began to shake violently. The lights flickered again, casting the car into alternating darkness and harsh illumination. "Give it back," the conductor roared, his voice echoing unnaturally. As Marla reached the next car, she slammed the door shut behind her and twisted the locking mechanism. She could see the conductor on the other side, his form twisting and contorting in ways that defied logic. His face pressed against the glass, his features finally visible. His eyes were empty sockets, black holes that seemed to suck in the light around them. The train jolted again, throwing her to the floor. She scrambled to her feet, the key still clutched in her hand. Ahead of her, the car was empty, except for a single bench. On it lay an envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with wax bearing the same strange symbols as the key. Marla hesitated, but a deep growl from behind her spurred her forward. She snatched up the envelope and tore it open. Inside was a single piece of parchment with writing that appeared to shift and writhe as she tried to read it. The only word she could make out was, "Unlock." Without thinking, she held the key up to the nearest door. To her astonishment, it fit perfectly into a hidden slot she hadn't noticed before. The door swung open, revealing a staircase leading downward, spiraling into darkness. Behind her, the conductor howled with rage, pounding on the locked door. "You can't escape, it won't let you." Marla didn't wait to find out what he meant. She stepped onto the staircase, the key glowing faintly in her hand as the door slammed shut behind her. The sound of the train and the conductor's screams faded, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. The only way out now was down. The staircase seemed endless, spiraling deeper into the earth with each step Marla took. The air grew colder and heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that made her stomach churn. The glow from the key in her hand was her only source of light, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the narrow stairwell. Finally, she reached the bottom, stepping into a vast underground chamber that defied all logic. The walls were lined with enormous, rusted gears and pipes that hissed and groaned, as if the entire structure were alive. Strange carvings adorned every surface, their shapes shifting when she tried to focus on them. In the center of the chamber stood an ornate pedestal, its surface marked with grooves that perfectly matched the key in her hand. As Marla approached, a deep, guttural voice echoed through the chamber, rattling the very ground beneath her feet. "You were not meant to come here," the voice boomed. Marla spun around, her eyes darting across the room. The shadows along the walls began to coalesce, forming a towering figure with elongated limbs and glowing red eyes. Its presence was suffocating, a primal terror that gripped her chest and made her legs feel like lead. "I didn't ask for this," she shouted, her voice trembling. "I just want to go home." The figure laughed, a low, menacing sound that reverberated through the chamber. "Home? There is no home for you now. You hold the key to a door that should never be opened." Marla's grip on the key tightened as she backed toward the pedestal. "If this key is so dangerous, then why did you let me find it?" The figure's eyes narrowed, its form flickering like a dying flame. "It was not I who chose you, but the key itself. You were marked the moment you touched it." Marla glanced at the pedestal, then back at the figure. She realized with growing dread that she had no choice. The key pulsed faintly in her hand, as if urging her forward. She approached the pedestal, the figure's laughter growing louder with every step. "Foolish girl. Do you think you can control what lies beyond?" "I don't care," she snapped, slamming the key into the grooves. "I just want this to end." The chamber shuddered violently as the key clicked into place. A low hum filled the air, growing in intensity until it was deafening. The pedestal split open, revealing a swirling void of darkness that seemed to pull at the edges of reality itself. The figure recoiled, its form unraveling like smoke. "You've unleashed it. You've doomed us all." Marla stared into the void, her mind struggling to comprehend its endless depths. She felt herself being drawn toward it, her body weightless as the darkness wrapped around her like a shroud. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the chamber fell silent. Marla opened her eyes to find herself back on the subway platform, the key gone from her hand. The train screeched into the station, its lights flickering as the doors slid open. Commuters bustled past her, oblivious to her disheveled state. But something was wrong. The air was too still, the shadows too deep. A faint, familiar whisper reached her ears. "You're not done yet." Marla turned to see her own reflection in the glass of the train's door. But the woman staring back wasn't her, it was something else, with eyes as black as the void she had seen. The doors closed and the train pulled away, leaving her alone on the platform, or so she thought. Behind her, the shadows began to move.